Margaret Meserve, historian. There wasn't any one system in Italy at the time. In fact, Italy in the age of the Renaissance is a period of political anarchy. You don't have any one leader. There wasn't a king of Italy or an emperor of Italy. So instead you had a patchwork of states, some of them based on cities, some of them based on territories, and each one was essentially vying with all of the others for survival and supremacy. And they essentially stayed in a state of almost constant war. In Rome, you had the Pope. In Venice, you had the Doges, who were elected officials, but they were elected from a very small group of patrician noble families who kept a very tight rein on power in the city. And Florence was also technically a republic. They had elections, democratically elected leaders. But again, in the 15th century, the one family, the Medici family, had essentially taken over control of those elected offices and ruled the city like princes, although they never called themselves princes. One thing that all the countries of Italy had, let me start that again. One thing that all the states in Italy had in common was enormous economic growth and prosperity. This was a period when merchants were traveling from Italy to the Far East, to the Middle East, around the rest of Europe. They were traders and bankers, and they amassed enormous amounts of money, all of which they brought home to their cities. So this was a period in which the cities were growing, beautiful new palaces were going up, fantastic churches, wonderful works of art were being commissioned by these new merchant princes who had all this money to throw around. So it was a prosperous period, but again, a very politically unstable period. For the most part, the old nobility who had lived out in the countryside, in castles, ridden their horses around, fought like knights, they were a class whose fortunes were declining during this period. And for the most part, it was the new merchant families who lived in the towns, who controlled the banking and trading networks, who were both piling up the most money and gaining the most political power for themselves at the same time. The Medici family were probably the most famous bankers of the entire Italian Renaissance, but they were quite late to the game. In the 13th and 14th centuries, there had been earlier great Italian banking families, but during the Black Death in 1348, most of them had gone bankrupt, and there was a great economic depression that took over Florence in the second half of the 14th century. The Medici family took advantage of that depression. They came in with a small amount of capital, and where all the other banks had failed, they set up shop and really launched a second wave of a banking boom in Renaissance Florence. And what the Medici did that was very smart, the previous banking families hadn't done, they made their wealth and their services available to the popes in Rome. And by forging an alliance with the papacy and essentially making themselves the Pope's personal bankers, they obviously got incredible business, and they also began to amass political influence and power. And it was by wedding their economic success and their political power together that they became the most powerful family in Florence. This was really the high point for the Medici family during the days of Lorenzo the Magnificent. That was what they called him. His grandfather, Cosimo de' Medici, had really established the bank and was a friend of popes and princes and had launched the family on this path to success. Lorenzo was the grandson. He was raised in this family with enormous wealth, grew up in the largest palace in Florence, and had the best tutors, wrote poetry himself, was a great patron of the arts. He really came into the family at its greatest point of prosperity. And yet all the while, he ruled Florence almost entirely from behind the scenes. He never put himself forward for election. He refused to take on any great position of government power. Rather, he stayed at home in his palace and very carefully selected who among the family's allies and friends would get elected to certain positions or promote certain policies within the state. Lorenzo and all of the Medici were famous for cultivating friends within the city of Florence, and they had friends at every level of society. So there were great families with whom they made alliances, but oftentimes there were regular people in the neighborhood whom the Medici family would make sure to take care of. They would send them wedding presents, they would help them out if someone got widowed, if somebody lost their job. The Medici were very careful to be good friends to Florentines of all social levels, with the expectation that when they needed it, those friends would come and help the Medici in return. So for Ezio to be a friend of Lorenzo in this way makes perfect sense. Lorenzo would have his eye on a number of bright, young, talented men within the city. He would lend a hand to them when they needed it, and then when he in turn was in trouble, he would be able to rely on them for help and support. Ezio would come from one of the socially prominent families in Florence with whom the Medici would ally themselves. So way back in the past, there might be marriage alliances, there might be business dealings, there might be some kind of shared tie between the families, and that would bind someone like Ezio into the circle of friends and clients and supporters that the Medici relied on. The Pazzi family were a family whose fortunes were in decline during this period. They came from an old noble family. There were these great old magnate noble families who had ruled Florence in earlier centuries. But after the city essentially kicked out their noble aristocratic class and established a republic, nobles were prohibited from holding office within the city. And obviously they resented this regime and were always plotting about ways to get themselves back into power. They especially didn't like someone like Lorenzo, because Lorenzo, the Medici, were a common family. They didn't have noble blood, so they were technically allowed to serve in government. Of course, Lorenzo had turned himself into a prince in all but name and was ruling the city like a prince, even though he claimed to be a commoner. So the Pazzi, who are these old nobles, are furious with the Medici because they think of them as usurpers. They've come in and taken over this city that used to be theirs, and there are generations of resentment there. Another thing the Pazzi tried to do was be bankers, but they also weren't as good at banking as the Medici were. So they had some business deals that had gone bad. The Pazzi had lost a lot of money. They were very resentful towards the Medici bank. So you have two different motivations that really get the Pazzi thirsting for Medici blood. They just want to kill and eliminate the entire family. And I think the way that the game shows the enmity between these two families is very realistic and lines up very much with what we know happened in 1478. There was a plot of, it was Easter weekend, and the conspiracy didn't go as it was, the conspiracy didn't go according to plan. The idea had been that the Medici brothers, Lorenzo and Giuliano, would be at a fancy banquet on the Saturday night before Easter, and the conspirators would attack them in the midst of the party in all of the confusion and make their getaway. But at the last minute, Giuliano de' Medici, the younger brother, was sick, whether for real or not, we don't know, but he didn't go to the dinner. And so the first plan was completely foiled. But all the conspirators were in Florence and ready to strike. So the next day was Easter Sunday, and the conspirators, who were friends and acquaintances of the Medici, went to the house and essentially grabbed hold of Lorenzo and Giuliano and said, let's all go to church together. And they go into the Duomo, the great central cathedral in Florence, and they all go up for the Mass. And at the very moment that the Mass is being celebrated, the conspirators suddenly turn on Lorenzo and Giuliano and try to kill them. They killed Giuliano, but Lorenzo managed to get away, and he locks himself in the sacristy of the church with a few of his closest companions, while other supporters of the Medici run out to find more of their allies and friends to come and help defeat the conspirators. Pope Alexander VI was a typical Renaissance pope in many ways, but he was also probably the worst of the Renaissance popes. So all the popes in the Renaissance treated the papal state like their own territorial kingdom. They raised armies, they marched into the field, they sacked cities, they launched campaigns against their enemies. All of them tended to rely on family members as close counselors and lieutenants, people they felt they could trust, because they never were sure whether the other cardinals in the Vatican were entirely on their side. So Alexander VI pursued exactly those strategies, but he took them to unheard of lengths. He had 4 illegitimate children of his own whom he kept with him in the Vatican palace. He made his son Cesare a cardinal and sent him personally out into the field to attack his own enemies. He used his daughter Lucrezia as a kind of dynastic pawn. He married her off to different Italian princes, always trying to create alliances with one state or another. And if the alliance fell through, he would annul the marriage and bring her back and then marry her off to somebody else again. So he was an incredibly cynical political operator. There are great stories that he had incestuous relations with Lucrezia, that he poisoned all of his enemies, and we don't really know if that's true, but the fact that he had that reputation tells you what people thought of him at the time. He was a pretty nasty operator. The popes could play the games of Renaissance diplomacy as well as anyone else. So they would find alliances with neighboring states. They would often triangulate against rival states somewhere else in Italy. They were very good at making alliances with certain parties in order to strengthen their position against their enemies somewhere else. And they weren't above using the weapons of the church against their enemies. So they would excommunicate the Venetians and make an alliance with the Florentines, but then 2 years later you'd find them excommunicating the Florentines and making an alliance with the Venetians. Ezio is a typical Italian nobleman in many ways. He's a fiery, violent, proud personality. He's terribly proud of his family and his family heritage and connections. When his family is injured, he's driven to avenge that injury. He has a very powerful sense of honor. And honor was one of the most important possessions an Italian man could have. A man would do anything to defend his honor, and often by going on the offensive and taking out his enemies, he could actually increase his stock of honor in the eyes of society around him. So Ezio, as he goes around and takes out his enemies and makes sure they know precisely why he's doing the things he's doing, is acting very much like an Italian man of honor. I think Ezio is very much an Italian Renaissance man. He has a real sense of his place in society, and he's going to defend it, both with words and with deeds. I like the way that he speaks for himself and uses words as well as action to defend himself and his family. I think that betrayal was an all too common phenomenon in the Italian Renaissance. There was such instability, both between states and then even within individual cities. It was never entirely clear who was in charge, who was in command, and there were always opportunities for an enterprising young person or family to leap up and seize control of a state, or even of a particular business or military venture. So people were, unfortunately, stabbing each other in the back and selling each other out all the time. It was just a function of this chaotic political system at the time. As a historian, I think it's terrific and fantastic to get to explore these cities as they were in the late 15th century. We know a lot about the art and the architecture and the layout of these cities in the 15th century, but most of them have been built over again in the 16th and the 17th and the 18th centuries. So if you go today, you have to really imagine away a lot of modern architecture in order to get back to that period. I think what's wonderful about the game is that you just are in the city as it was in the 1470s or 1480s, and the research that's gone into reconstructing the city at that particular historical moment looks just terrific to me. I think the period 1476 to 1506 is an absolutely fascinating period in European history. It's the height of the Italian Renaissance. This is when the most beautiful paintings, the greatest sculptures, the most wonderful architecture are all being built and created. And at the same time, it's a period of political intrigue and drama and violence as well. This is the period in which individual princes really emerge out of this Italian political chaos to leave their own stamp of personality on the states that they rule. So Lorenzo de' Medici, Pope Alexander VI, Pope Julius II, the Sforza dukes in Milan. These are towering personalities, and they create their states almost as works of art, which they rule and fashion as an artist works on his own masterpiece. The artistic Renaissance has a number of facets to it. On the one hand, it's a function of just the sheer economic prosperity of the times. People are making money and they're looking for ways to spend it. They're building palaces for themselves, and then they need to furnish those palaces, and they're interested in finding beautiful objects and making them their own. At the same time, there's a cultural movement happening in which people are looking back to the culture of the ancient world as something interesting and new that had been neglected for a long time, and now artists and scholars were going to discover it again. So there's a real cultural movement to rediscover classical forms, the nude, perspective in painting, Roman and Greek styles of architecture, and it's very exciting because the artists are creating things that haven't been seen for 1,000 years or more, and they're bringing them all back to life during just this time. I think the design of the cities is accurate. Florence in the late 15th century looked very much as it does today, and Venice as well. I think one thing that's fascinating is to see Rome reconstructed as it looked in the 15th century, because Rome has been so much rebuilt and redone during the Baroque period and later. So to be able to see what Rome looked like before the new St. Peter's was built, before all the great Baroque palaces were constructed, that's a very exciting and unusual thing to see. I think the fact that new media are wanting to explore historical themes is a great thing. I think it reflects a real interest in the larger public in historical subjects and periods of time. I think it also reflects that most people actually do know quite a bit about periods in the historical past, and they're interested in games and movies and historical fiction because it helps them to build on some of the things that they already do know about. So most people know something about Leonardo da Vinci. Most people have heard of Lorenzo de' Medici, and it's great for a game like this to give them a chance to learn a bit more. I've been really surprised and impressed with the historical accuracy of the game. I think the attention to detail, the characters who are real and coming out of the historical record, who turn up and make appearances in the game are very accurate, and the dialogue, the issues that the character confronts, the way he responds to problems and challenges, all of that I think is very accurate and close to the historical truth. At the same time, the setting is just fantastic to have these entire urban environments recreated with real attention to detail. I think is a great and very impressive thing about the game.